What if the oldest history is not history at all, but a kind of leftover dreaming? What if the first cities were not beginnings, but returns? What if, long before anyone carved a king's name into clay, the world already knew what kings would do and tried to prevent it? The tablets never introduced themselves. Like a clean story, with a clean start, they open the way a half-remembered place opens, quietly, as if you have been there before, even if you cannot explain how. What the fragments describe is an earth that feels older than its own records. Not ancient in the romantic way, but ancient in the tired way, as if something has already failed, and the ground is still carrying the weight of it. Later scribes copied these lines, and copied them again, as if copying itself was the point. They do not say, "This is true." They say, "This is what was preserved." They speak of measures that appear fully formed. They speak of the city as a shape already known, walls set at angles that serve more than defense, streets positioned as if listening to something above, and in the margins of those descriptions, in phrases that do not belong to ordinary accounting, there is a recurring softness, a refusal to be direct. What the tablets describe, what later hands remembered indirectly, is an age when knowledge arrived too complete, too soon, not invented, delivered, not discovered, restored. There are lists of kings, and there are lists of offerings, and there are lists of grain. But behind those lists, there is an unspoken suggestion that the lists begin late, that the world was already old, before anyone started counting it. The reign lengths are impossible, long spans that turn the idea of a human lifetime into something thin and uncertain. Some later scribes tried to normalize the numbers, as if embarrassed by them. Others left them untouched, as if fearing that to correct them would be a more dangerous falsehood. Not explain, they simply keep copying, and in the way the copying continues, a pattern appears, not a pattern of facts, but a pattern of caution, as if the scribes themselves were aware of boundaries, as if they were trained to preserve, but not to awaken. The fragments speak of the sky as something once nearer, not physically nearer, but accessible, as if the stars were once not merely lights, but references, as if the heavens were once consulted, the way a skilled builder consults a plan. In later ages, the sky becomes a symbol, a religion, a story, but in these earlier traces, the sky is described as an instrument panel, a set of repeating cycles that can be read and in some way used. This is where the unease begins, because the tablets do not sound amazed. They sound controlled. They sound like people who have learned to speak softly in a room where something listens. They imply that to know too much is to invite correction, not punishment. Correction, as if the world is a mechanism, and certain knowledge turns the wrong gears. There's a phrase that appears in different forms, across different copies, not always identical, but similar in feeling. It suggests that before the recognized dynasties, before the official measures, there was an earlier arrangement, and that arrangement ended not with a dramatic sentence, not with a thunderclap, but with a dissolving. The tablets do not say, "The world was destroyed." They suggest, "It forgot its shape." That is the quietest terror in the fragments. Not death, forgetting, not extinction, misalignment, as if the land remained, and the water remained, and the people remained, but the relationships between them lost their agreed form. And after that, everything that follows is described as careful, as if rebuilding is permitted, but remembrance is restricted. The texts mention teachers, but not in the way later myths do. Not glowing beings, not theatrical visitors. They are described like administrators, as measurers, as dividers, as those who set limits. Later traditions would name them, and later religions would elevate them. But what the fragments suggest, what was preserved indirectly, is something colder and more precise. That knowledge was once released, too freely, and afterward, it had to be portioned, like water after a drought, like fire after a forest burns. The earliest cities rise under this new condition. They are strong, but contained. They are brilliant, but incomplete. They are designed not only to function, but to limit. And if you listen long enough to the way the tablets speak, you begin to feel something else, a faint memory of a place, ringed with water, a wide place, not a nation, not an empire, a center. The tablets do not name it. Later storytellers would, and they would give it a polished name, as if a name could turn caution into romance. But the oldest traces avoid naming, as if naming is a kind of reassembly. So they speak around it. They describe a place where knowledge circulated without gates, where memory was shared, not hoarded, and where the end came, not from invasion, but imbalance, as if the greatest danger was not enemies, but accelerated awareness. And in the way these fragments are preserved, in the way they hesitate, you can feel the old question forming. What if civilization is not growing? What if it is recovering? And what if recovery always includes forgetting? Not because humans are weak, but because forgetting is part of the design. The tablets do not answer. They do what they always do. They continue, slowly, as if inviting you to drift closer to the point where memory becomes heavy. And this is where the old accounts become difficult to forget. What the fragments suggest next is not a single event, but a turning, a change in how the world is managed. It is described indirectly, through sudden shifts in what is permitted, through the tightening of language, through the appearance of boundaries that were not present before. One copy speaks of rules, as if rules are a natural phenomenon. Another speaks of assignments, as if the world is divided into duties. And beneath these phrases, there is the sense of a presence that does not belong to ordinary human governance. Later scribes remembered names, and those names would become the Anunnaki in later telling. But the older phrasing does not sound religious. It sounds procedural. It describes those beings, or that class of beings, as measurers, those who count, those who portion, those who limit. The fragments do not say they created humanity. They say they adjusted it. They introduced reductions, not as cruelty, but as safety. Lifespan becomes shorter, as if time is being compressed into manageable units. Dream becomes narrower, as if the mind is being folded. Perception becomes more local, as if the human senses are being asked to stay near the ground. The tablets do not moralize. They do not say, this was good, or this was evil. They imply, this was necessary, after what came before. And what came before is never described in full, only hinted. A world where knowledge moved too quickly, where awareness spread too broadly, where the sky was red, without restraint. The fragments suggest there was disagreement among the measurers. This is important because it means the system itself contains tension. Some copies preserve a tone that feels generous, as if one faction wanted to teach. Others preserve a tone that feels strict, as if another faction wanted to contain. The old accounts do not turn this into drama. They never do. They preserve it. As policy shifts, one generation is allowed to build more. The next is constrained. One age is encouraged to observe. The next is taught to worship instead. Worship is safer than understanding, because worship does not replicate. Understanding does. This is the logic that rises, like a quiet current, beneath the narratives, and then the fragments mention. something that feels like the origin of later priesthoods, a class of people trained not to discover, but to maintain, not to innovate, but to preserve and to gate. The tablets imply that certain lineages held fragments of the older knowledge in pieces too small to become dangerous alone. Astronomy, but with gaps. Engineering, but with missing angles. Medicine, but without the deeper principles. All of it present, all of it incomplete. This is how restraint is built, not by removing knowledge entirely, but by fracturing it. The fragments describe the first great teaching as a controlled release. City plans are given, not found. Agriculture is introduced, not invented. Writing appears, already capable. Law arrives, already shaped. It is as if the world is being restarted from a toolkit kept somewhere beyond ordinary reach. And yet, a strange tenderness remains in the record, because the measurers, as the fragments portray them, do not seem to hate humanity. They seem to fear what humanity becomes when awareness outruns wisdom. They fear a repetition more than they fear a rebellion. This fear is never shouted. It is embedded in the carefulness of the text, in the way certain topics are approached sideways, in the way certain names are avoided, and again, the memory of the wide place, ringed with water, returns, not as a proud remembrance, as a warning kept alive through omission. Later scribes would call it Atlantis and would turn it into a symbol. But what the fragments suggest is more unsettling than symbol. They imply that such a place was a working model, a civilization arranged around open memory, and that open memory became the very condition that ended it, not because knowledge is evil, but because knowledge, without patience, destroys its own foundations. The fragments suggest that the end did not arrive as a foreign army. It arrived as imbalance, as heat without humility, as power without guidance. And when the imbalance reached a threshold, the world did something that feels automatic. It corrected itself. The tablets do not say, the gods were angry. They say, the ground changed. They say, the waters rose. They say, the winds arrived. They say, the world forgot its shape. And those who managed the system, those who measured and divided, did not mourn publicly. They reorganized. They allowed survival, but they enforced reduction. After this, the world would never again be permitted to remember too quickly. And this is why the king lists begin late, because kings are not the beginning of humanity. They are the beginning of permitted history. What came before was too close to awakening, so it was reclassified. It became myth. It became rumor. It became the kind of story people tell at night to soothe themselves without realizing it is not meant to soothe. The fragments continue, and the way they continue feels like a descent into structure time, as if we are leaving the open ocean and entering a channel, and somewhere in that narrowing, you begin to sense that the next thing is not a story of heroes. It is a story of erasure performed as maintenance, quietly, with water, with wind, with the calm precision of a world that has done this before. The flood in the fragments does not arrive like punishment. It arrives like a function. The earliest lines do not say, the world was destroyed. They say, boundaries loosened, as if the agreement between land and water was renegotiated. The tablets describe the rise of water with a strange lack of emotion, not because the writers did not fear it, but because they were describing something larger than fear, a system returning to balance. Cities dissolve, not only in the physical sense, but in the conceptual sense. Streets lose meaning when the reference points vanish. Walls become pointless. when everything becomes shoreline. The fragments describe people carrying tablets, not because tablets are sacred, but because tablets are memory. And memory is the only thing that can float across a reset. There are lines about boats, and lines about animals, and lines about wind. But beneath them, there is an older implication that the flood did not simply cover land. It disrupted alignment. The sky, as referenced by the older city plans, no longer matches the ground. The rivers change their paths. Mountains shift in a way mountains shift, only in stories, or in epics too large for ordinary human witnessing. And when the waters recede, the world that returns is not the previous world. It is a reduced world, a world designed to be less reconstructible. This is the most unsettling suggestion in the flood memory, that the reset was not only about cleansing, it was about preventing reassembly. Because if the old alignment remained, then the old knowledge could reconnect too easily. So the world itself becomes a lock. The fragments describe survivors standing on new shorelines, looking at familiar constellations that feel slightly wrong. Not wrong in the obvious way, but wrong in the subtle way. That makes the mind itch, as if something has been shifted a few degrees, just enough to break a mechanism, while leaving beauty intact. The tablets then do something that later readers often miss. They begin counting again. They begin listing kings. This is not vanity. It is a sign the system has stabilized. Time has been standardized into shorter spans. Mortality has taken a firm hold. The impossible reign lengths shrink, not because scribes become honest, but because the world has changed. The fragments imply that the earlier age had a different relationship with time, not immortality, but a different structure, as if consciousness once moved through cycles in a way that made years less meaningful. After the flood, time becomes heavy, linear, countable. This is where history begins. And in the beginning of history, you find the first sanctioned cities. The fragments suggest that plans were reintroduced. That measurement was given again, but in a restrained format. Enough for agriculture, enough for irrigation, enough for temple economy, not enough to rebuild the older access, not enough to read the sky. As an instrument panel, the heavens become sacred again, because sacredness is safer. The fragments preserve the rise of Sumer, like a new ignition, not the first flame, but the first permitted flame. City names appear, and along with them, the language of offerings and debts, and the careful ordering of labor. The world becomes administrable. That is what the tablets celebrate. If they celebrate anything, not beauty, not freedom, stability, and beneath this stability, the old caution remains. There are hints of older lineages, families that hold fragments, priests who preserve numbers. Without explaining them, there are references to measures from before, to plans that descended, to instructions brought down. Always the same indirect tone, always the same refusal to declare too much. And again, the memory of the wide place, ringed with water, returns. Now it returns as a gap, a missing chapter that later cultures attempt to fill with romance. But the fragments themselves seem unwilling to allow the listener to build a full picture. They preserve only enough to keep the caution alive, a place where knowledge was open, a place where hierarchy was minimal, a place where memory was shared. And the end came, as if the world corrected imbalance. If that place was real, or if it is a composite memory, stitched from multiple losses, the tablets do not clarify. They do not need to, because the function of a memory is not to provide a map. It is to shape behavior, to warn gently, without provoking obsession. But obsession is precisely what happens when the mind hears a warning and mistakes it for an invitation. The fragments continue, and with them the sense that a hidden system is guiding the rhythm of rise and collapse, not as a plot, not as a conspiracy, as maintenance. The world prunes itself, the way a tree prunes itself. Branches that grow too fast are broken by wind. Roots that spread too aggressively are drowned by water. Afterward, new growth appears, slower, more cautious, more manageable, and the tablets seem to accept this, the way one accepts weather. The scribes do not rage. They record, they copy, they preserve, as if their true task is not to change the pattern, but to ensure that someone later feels it in the quiet of night, when the mind is soft enough to recognize that history may not be a straight path. It may be a corridor, lined with doors. Some doors open easily. Others are sealed, not by force, but by misalignment. And perhaps the flood was the world's way of shifting the lock, just enough to keep the deepest door closed. For a little longer, the fragments drift onward into a world of temples and kings, and measured labor, and the slow building of sanctioned civilization. And beneath it all, the same question remains. If the world corrected itself once, and then again, how many corrections have already happened that no one remembers, and how many are still hidden beneath the waterline of ordinary consciousness? After the flood memory, the fragments grow strangely practical. They fill with lists, contracts, ration accounts, temple inventories, as if the world is being anchored deliberately into the ordinary, because ordinary life is stabilizing, and stability is the first defense against the return of excess. The tablets imply that the post-flood era is an era of permission. This does not mean freedom. It means controlled allowance. Certain skills are released, and certain skills are withheld. Writing exists, but its deeper purposes are guarded. Astronomy exists, but is framed as omen, not as mechanism. Engineering exists, but it is tied to ritual, to authority, to centralized projects. The city becomes not merely a place to live, but a structure that shapes minds. It teaches people what to care about: debt, grain, status, sacrifice, lineage. It narrows focus. It makes the world predictable. The fragments describe the rise of temple economies with the calm of inevitability. The temple is not only a religious structure, it is an interface, a place where humans interact with the managers of the system through offerings, through rituals, through controlled narratives. This is how guidance becomes indirect. The old accounts suggest that direct instruction was reduced, not because the instructors vanished, but because direct instruction creates direct replication, and replication was the previous danger. So instruction becomes symbol. Symbol becomes myth. Myth becomes law. Law becomes habit. And habit becomes the new containment. In this era, kings appear as necessary figures, not because they are noble, but because central authority simplifies control. The king list, as preserved indirectly, is a kind of boundary marker. It tells the reader that sanctioned history begins here. Everything before this is too unstable to be counted openly. The reigns are still long. At first, they carry the echo of older time, but they shorten as generations proceed until they resemble the lifespans we recognize. The fragments do not say, "This is decline." They imply, "This is normalization," a narrowing of the human channel into manageable widths. And while the world becomes ordinary, Another thing happens, almost unnoticed. Memory hides itself. Into stone, the fragments preserve references to alignments in temples. That only makes sense if someone is still watching the sky. With the older precision, the temples face directions that do not match obvious geography. They match something above. They are positioned as if the builders still possess certain keys, but those keys are held by a limited class, not shared widely, because wide sharing is what ended the wide place, ringed with water. And here again, the memory returns, not as a named continent, not as a romantic lost paradise, as a pressure behind the text, a sense that the scribes are avoiding certain images, a ring of water, a central city, a place where memory was distributed, a place where people did not need priests to access knowledge, a place where the sky was consulted. Without fear, the fragments suggest that this openness was the true catastrophe because it allowed human consciousness to synchronize too quickly. When awareness synchronizes, power concentrates, not necessarily in hands, but in the mind itself. The mind becomes capable of moving too fast, and fast movement breaks fragile foundations. So after the flood, the world engineers slowness through hierarchy, through ritual, through fragmentation of knowledge. And in later ages, when people discover that many cultures share similar myths, similar architecture, similar star stories, they often assume coincidence. The fragments suggest another possibility, that this similarity is intentional, a controlled distribution of partial memory, enough to keep humanity oriented, not enough to restore the previous access. The scribe's record, the building of ziggurats, artificial mountains, layered steps toward the sky, they are described not as defiance, but as participation, a way to connect without reconnecting fully, a compromise. The human desire to ascend is acknowledged, but it is directed into ritual, so it does not become mechanism again. And then, in quieter corners of the record, there are hints of those who do not accept the slow containment. There are references to secret knowledge, to forbidden measurements, to words from before, past in whispers, not as rebellion, as longing. The longing itself is dangerous because longing is how memory tries to heal, and healing may recreate the old imbalance. This is why the fragments speak softly whenever the topic approaches the earlier age. They do not want to trigger the longing, but they cannot erase it, because longing is what makes civilization restless. Without longing, humans would accept their small permitted world. With longing, they reach upward again. They build, they measure, they explore, and each era finds its own way to approach the threshold. The old accounts imply that the system watches, not as a tyrant watches, as a mechanism watches, like a riverbank watches. The rising water, when the water reaches a certain height, the bank either holds or breaks, and if it breaks, the floodplain resets everything, without malice, only function. This is the cold comfort and the cold dread in the fragments, that the world is not personal, is patterned, and yet the fragments hint that something within the pattern still argues. Some keepers favor sharing, some favor restriction. This argument is never resolved. It plays out across millennia in the difference between civilizations that lock knowledge into priesthood and civilizations that distribute it more widely. The fragments preserve the tension, as if the tension itself is the engine of the cycle. Without restriction, humanity accelerates and collapses. Without sharing, humanity stagnates and rots. So the system moves between them, a measured oscillation, a controlled wave. The scribes copy all this without commenting, because their role is not to choose sides. Their role is to preserve the feeling that civilization is being guided and limited, not as a punishment, but as a response to something that happened before permission began. And if you listen in the quiet between lines, you can almost hear the old sea around the wide place, ringed with water, not calling you to travel there, calling you to remember why it could not remain. The fragments do not speak of a modern world directly. They do not name cities of steel. They do not mention wires. They do not mention engines. But they do something subtler. They describe conditions. They describe the approach to a familiar threshold, a time when knowledge spreads faster than restraint, a time when separate disciplines begin to align, a time when the sky returns to mechanism, not for priests, for everyone. The tablets preserve earlier versions of the same moment, an age of towers, an age of shared language, an age when humanity nearly remembers too much, too quickly. The fragments imply that when synchronization accelerates, dispersion follows, sometimes by choice, sometimes by catastrophe, sometimes by administrative correction, but always the same function. And now, in this implied present, the same conditions arise. Knowledge is global. Curiosity is immediate. Information moves without gatekeepers. The older systems of priesthood have been replaced by other systems that move just as quickly and often just as blindly. The fragments would not call this evil. They would call it speed. And speed is what the older world could not survive. This is where the memory of the wide place, ringed with water, returns most strongly, because that place, as preserved indirectly, was the first experiment in open memory. And open memory ended in reset, not because openness is wrong, but because openness, without maturity, creates imbalance. The fragments do not state this as a moral law. They preserve it as a pattern. They suggest that each cycle asks the same question: can wisdom catch up before correction becomes necessary? The tablets never answer, because they never witnessed a cycle where wisdom won. Or perhaps they witnessed it once, and that is why the fragments exist at all. A faint, stubborn hope, embedded in clay. The scribes describe the end of certain lines, not with drama, but with silence. Records stop mid-phrase. Calculations remain unfinished, as if the writers were interrupted, or as if they understood that some knowledge must remain partial to remain safe. In one tradition, the final lines mention the old measures being sealed away. In another, they speak of the deep place where tablets are stored, beneath water, beneath stone, beneath memory itself. Not a library in the ordinary sense, a vault, a controlled archive for a future mind, patient enough to approach without hunger. And hunger is the danger, because hunger makes knowledge a weapon. Even gentle curiosity can become hunger when it is fed too quickly. The fragments preserve a feeling that the world itself may participate in restraint, that the earth may shift alignments, that the sky may change reference points, that floods and winds may be part of a larger balancing system, not personal, not angry, not divine in the theatrical sense, a kind of maintenance. And yet, this is not the only feeling. There is also a quieter presence, a sense that something old is watching, not like a predator, like a caretaker who has seen the same mistake many times. The fragments suggest that the keepers of limits, whether they are the measurers or the descendants of those measurers, or simply the inherited pattern itself, continue, not necessarily as beings, walking among us, but as pressures, as thresholds, as invisible constraints in the fabric of events. And this is where the listener may begin to feel the most unsettling possibility. That collapse is not a failure of civilization. It is a feature of the cycle. Rise, accelerate, approach the threshold, reset, rise again. The fragments do not say, "This is hopeless." They simply refuse to guarantee escape. They imply that escape would require something humans rarely practice: slowness, not laziness, not stagnation. Slowness as maturity. Slowness as patience. Slowness as the ability to hold power without hunger. If that sounds simple, the fragments imply it is the rarest achievement, because every era believes its knowledge is new. Every era believes its speed is justified. Every era thinks the old warnings are just stories until the world forgets its shape. Again, the tablets do not end with a conclusion. They fade, as if the record steps away and leaves space. In that space, the question remains, softly, like a lingering tide. What if civilization is not moving forward? What if it is circling? And what if, this time, the cycle hesitates, not because the keepers decide to stop it, but because humanity finally learns to carry knowledge without hunger? What if remembering is finally allowed to complete itself? And if it does complete itself, what will return with it? The wide place, ringed with water, the old sky, as mechanism, the hidden measurements that make cities feel like returns. The fragments do not say. They only leave you with the sense that the world has been here before, and that the next correction, if it comes, will not come with anger. It will come with the calm precision of a system doing what it has always done, unless quietly, almost impossibly, something changes, not outside, inside. And that is where the old accounts become difficult to forget, because they do not demand belief. They demand attention, the kind of attention that arrives only when you are half awake, half dreaming, listening to clay, remembering water, and wondering, in the hush between thoughts, whether the world is about to remember or about to forget. Once more,